We did get some more books. Does anybody need a book? Anybody else need a book? Sure. Two more or just one more? All right. All right, let's begin. We'll read through Ecclesiastes chapter 2 from the New King James first, and then the second time through from the New International Version. In Ecclesiastes 2, I said in my heart, come now, I will test you with mirth. Therefore enjoy pleasure, but surely this also was vanity. I said of laughter madness, and of mirth what does it accomplish? I searched in my heart how to gratify my flesh with wine, while guiding my heart with wisdom, and how to lay hold on folly, till I might see what was good for the sons of men to do under heaven all the days of their lives. I made my works great. I built myself houses and planted myself vineyards. I made myself gardens and orchards, and I planted all kinds of fruit trees in them. I made myself water pools from which to water the growing trees of the grove. I acquired male and female servants, and had servants born in my house. Yes, I had greater possessions of herds and flocks than all who were in Jerusalem before me. I also gathered for myself silver and gold and the special treasures of kings and of the provinces. I acquired male and female singers, the delights of the sons of men, and musical instruments of all kinds. So I became great and excelled more than all who were in Jerusalem, who were before me in Jerusalem. Also my wisdom remained with me. Whatever my eyes desired, I did not keep from them. I did not withhold from my heart from any pleasure. For my heart rejoiced in all my labor, and this was my reward from all my labor. Then I looked on all the works that my hands had done, and on the labor in which I had toiled. And indeed all was vanity and grasping for wind. There was no profit under the sun. Then I turned myself to consider wisdom and madness and folly. For what can the man do who succeeds the king? Only what he has already done. Then I saw that wisdom excels folly as light excels darkness. The wise man's eyes are in his head, but the fool walks in darkness. Yet I myself perceive that the same event happens to them all. So I said to my heart, as it happens to the fool, it also happens to me. And why was I then more wise? Then I said in my heart, this also is vanity. For there is no more remembrance of the wise than of the fool forever, since all that is now will be forgotten in the days to come. And how does a wise man die? As the fool. Therefore I hated life, because the work that was done under the sun was distressing to me, for all is vanity and grasping for the wind. Then I hated all my labor in which I had toiled under the sun, because I must leave it to the man who will come after me. And who knows whether he will be wise or a fool, yet he will rule over all my labor in which I toiled, and in which I have shown myself wise under the sun. This also is vanity. Therefore I turned my heart and despaired of all the labor in which I had toiled under the sun. For there is a man whose labor is with wisdom, knowledge, and skill, yet he must leave his heritage to a man who has not labored for it. This also is vanity and a great evil. For what has man for all his labor, and for the striving of his heart, under which he has toiled under the sun? For all his days are sorrowful, and his work burdensome. Even in the night his heart takes no rest. This also is vanity. Nothing is better for a man that he should eat and drink, and that his soul should enjoy good in his labor. This also I saw was from the hand of God. For who can eat, or who can have enjoyment? For who can eat, or who can have enjoyment more than I? For God gives wisdom and knowledge and joy to a man who is good in his sight. But to the sinner he gives the work of gathering and collecting, that he may give to him who is good before God. This also is vanity and grasping for the wind. I said to myself, come now, I will test you with pleasure to find out what is good. But that also proved to be meaningless. Laughter, I said, is madness, and what does pleasure accomplish? I tried cheering myself with wine and embracing folly, my mind still guiding me with wisdom. I wanted to see what was good for people to do under the heavens during the few days of their lives. I undertook great projects. I built houses for myself and planted vineyards. I made gardens and parks and planted all kinds of fruit trees in them. I made reservoirs to water groves of flourishing trees. I bought male and female slaves who had other slaves who were born into my house. I also owned more herds and flocks than anyone in Jerusalem before me. I amassed silver and gold for myself and the treasure of kings and provinces. I acquired male and female singers and a harem as well, the delights of a man's heart. I became greater by far than anyone in Jerusalem before me. In all this, my wisdom stayed with me. I denied myself nothing my eyes desired. I refused my heart no pleasure. My heart took delight in all my labor, and this was the reward for my toil. Yet when I surveyed all that my hands had done and what I had toiled to achieve, everything was meaningless. A chasing after the wind, nothing was gained under the sun. Then I turned my thoughts to consider wisdom, and also madness and folly. What more can the king's successor do than what has already been done? I saw that wisdom is better than folly, just as light is better than darkness. The wise have eyes in their heads, while the fool walks in the darkness. But I came to realize that the same fate overtakes them both. Then I said to myself, the fate of the fool will overtake me also. What then do I gain by being wise? I said to myself, this too is meaningless. For the wise, like the fool, will not be long remembered. The days have already come when both have been forgotten. Like the fool, the wise too must die. So I hated life, because the work that is done under the sun was grievous to me. All of it is meaningless, a chasing after the wind. I hated all the things I had toiled for under the sun, because I must leave them to the one who comes after me. And who knows whether that person will be wise or foolish. Yet they will have control over all the fruit of my toil, into which I have poured my effort and skill under the sun. This too is meaningless. So my heart began to despair over all my toilsome labor under the sun. For a person may labor with wisdom, knowledge, and skill, and then they must leave all they own to another who has not toiled for it. This too is meaningless and a great misfortune. What do people get for all the toil and anxious striving which they labor under the sun? All their days their work is grief and pain. Even at night their minds do not rest. This too is meaningless. A person can do nothing better than to eat and drink and find satisfaction in their own toil. This too I see is from the hand of God. For without him, who can eat or find enjoyment? To the person who pleases him, God gives wisdom, knowledge, and happiness. But to the sinner, he gives the task of gathering and storing up wealth to hand it over to the one who pleases God. This too is meaningless, a chasing after the wind. So we get two sections in this chapter. First of all, we'll see that Solomon went on an exploration, essentially, to start here. And he goes through several things that he tried, and we'll talk about all of those and his conclusions from that. And then he makes a comparison of wisdom and fools toward the middle of the chapter. And finally, at the end, we might see a little bit of wisdom finally coming out of Solomon in this passage. The author names this one the playboy who would be king. And I think verse 3 to me sets the stage for what Solomon is doing. So the second half of verse 3 from the NIV read, I wanted to see what was good for people to do under the heavens during the few days of their lives. So essentially, he just wanted to go see what was out there, didn't he? And as we noted last week, his problem was what? Yeah, he left out God. And Norm A made this point last week. As you read through this, what do you see? Every verse is that he was thinking about what he had done and what he was able to accomplish, but then he found it all meaningless because he had left God behind. And we see this in our society. The author, this slogan of the day: if it feels good, do it. Yeah, and he makes the point that that's a very old slogan in the sense that he compares it back to Luke 12 verse 19, where it was said, "Take your ease, eat, drink, and be merry." Pretty much the same thing in it. That this has been a philosophy of man that's gone on, I guess, as long as man has been around. And what we need to learn from it is the wisdom that he found from going through this, and how to take it and apply it in our lives. So if we kind of go through the list of things that he tried here. So he starts with pleasure. You know, he didn't deny himself pleasure. And when I was thinking about that, I thought about Moses. Remember what it said about Moses? What decision did Moses make about pleasure? Norm?
He gave up the passing pleasures that he could have gotten being the prince of Egypt for basically the bigger long-term treasure that was out there.
Ken, did you have something else?
I was just going to say, he chose to suffer with the people of God rather than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season.
Yeah, and that the end of that was what kind of struck me, was for a season. And I think that's kind of what Solomon ended up concluding as well, that pleasure is seasonable. In the sense of, in the end, didn't he just kind of get bored with it? And isn't that what it seems like? You know, I tried all this pleasure. And when we think about that in our context, you know, if folks that indulge in fleshly things, what tends to happen? It starts small and then it tends to grow. And yeah, if you think about it in terms of, we could use alcohol. You know, starts with a few drinks. Well, a few make me feel like I want to. Then what happens? Well, I need a few more, don't I? And then I need a few more. And ultimately, yeah, it leads me into alcoholism and all kinds of things. And I think we could take almost any pleasure that is out there, that it just it builds on itself. It requires more and more. And in the end, Solomon just says that that this is meaningless. He finds that it's meaningless, versus making the right decision like Moses did, and denying the pleasures of sin for a season, as it says there. And I think what we typically see is that it doesn't ultimately provide anything, does it? We think it does. It feels good for a while, right? But in the end, we end up empty, because we know the answer. We've left God out of the equation, right? When we go and start pursuing worldly or fleshly pleasures and remove God, ultimately that's going to take us nowhere but heartache. The second thing that he talks about is laughter. Now, is laughter a bad thing? If it is, Norm's in trouble, isn't he? So laughter. There's nothing wrong with laughter, but I think that really the author makes the point here that that he's reminding us that the good life is more than amusement and entertainment. And again, we understand that, right? That life isn't all about just being entertained and having fun all the time. I mean, it's good. It's good for us to balance things. I think that's actually, we'll get to that at the end as one of our conclusions. But, that just seeking entertainment and amusement all the time is not something that brings that brought any pleasure to Solomon in the end. The next thing that he talks about is wine, or drink. Again, we alluded to that a second ago. So how does our society picture drinking? Sexy. Now, do the people you see drinking in advertisements ever have a bad time? It's a delusion, isn't it? They're trying to convince you to partake in this. I remember D. Bowman in a sermon once was talking about New York City, and he was talking about going in New York City at night and all the lights and how amazing it was. But then the next morning, when the sun came out and he saw drunks on the side of the street and all these kind of things, it wasn't quite as good as it appeared. And I think a lot of these things, with obviously wine included, that if it's not nearly as good as it appears. And in Solomon's case, he was probably having the best of the best too, wasn't he? The $1,000 bottles of aged wine or whatever. You know he wasn't denying himself, but again, he found that in the end, it was meaningless. The next thing was houses. Now, what's wrong with houses and vineyards and nice trees and landscaping and all that kind of stuff? Focus wrong, right? The focus is wrong. Now, I think that one thing that we need to be careful about sometimes with these kind of things is in our society we can get we're judged, who we are is judged by what we have. Ooh, look at that big old house. It must be, and we'll make judgments about people because of the size of their house or the niceness of their house or whatever, or even about, of their personality, but how they keep their yards up and things like that. But we can, as we see here, in the end, it didn't satisfy Solomon, and it won't us either. I think we've all probably known people that are always out for the next house. Build one, I now need a bigger one. Build another one, I need a bigger one. And in the end, it probably just turns out to be more work and more expense than anything else. The next one was servants. How many servants did Solomon have? Lots, right? he bought them, he grew them, so to speak. He had them born in his own house. With the conclusion being what? What kind of life was he living? With all these, with servants empty. Yeah, but we kind of think about, he was being served continuously, wasn't he? Do you think he mowed his grasses out there, plucked the fruit trees or whatever, all those things, he cleaned the houses he had built? Now, I mean, he was in a position where anything he wanted, all he had to do is ring the bell or snap his fingers, whatever he did back then, for the master servant to show up. What do you want? What do you need? And send somebody off to do it. But in the end, he found that it was just kind of boring, continued boredom there. Then the next one he went into was possessions. And that's kind of another one, kind of similar to what we talked about with the house. What if I got more stuff than everybody else? Then maybe I'll be happy. And I think that's another thing that we especially can learn from. And I think this is one that I really appreciated Eric's sermon, if y'all were here for the meeting, about talking about to his younger self. I think a lot of times as younger people, we can get in this trap, especially right when we first, like he was describing. Well, I got my first job, so I gotta have a nice car, I gotta have a house, there's these things that it's like, well, I got a job now, I need all these things, and obviously his conclusion was, well, I really didn't need all that debt that created. So there's a wisdom here in just being careful. And in his case, how many herds did he have? More than anybody had ever had in Jerusalem, right? So, in other words, way too many, probably more than he could count, or probably even he knew he had. The next one was collecting. So when we think about collecting, what do we think about? Memorabilia, baseball cards. Or coins, maybe. Now, I remember we laugh at my father, because my father was convinced that Beanie Babies were the way to put our children through college. So he's like, okay, you save those Beanie Babies we bought you, and you'll be able to sell them and put the kids through college. Luckily, we planned elsewhere, because I think when Beanie Baby reissued, that messed up all the ones that were worth a lot. But it's kind of some of the things that we collect. But what did Solomon collect? Gold and silver. I mean, he collected gold and silver. He had so much that what was the comment? I think the author references from 1 Kings that it was as common as stones in Jerusalem. That's a lot of silver and gold, isn't it? That's what he was able to collect. So, I mean, the implication is this was the thing that in their society was the most valuable. He collected it, had more. It actually became commonplace. Did it satisfy him? No, that didn't, did it? Having everything. Then the next one was entertainment. Singers and all this. Just we kind of just see this going. He is literally doing what he said he was out to do in verse 3, wasn't he? Anything he could think of, he's out there trying it. He's going to give it a shot and see if it produces wisdom. But did you find verse, I think it maybe shows up a couple of times, but I noticed it in verse 9. He talks about all this stuff. Then he says, in all this, my wisdom stayed with me. I'm like, really? Are you sure? It sure doesn't seem like it. Maybe there was a twinge of it back there somewhere in his head going, Solomon, this really isn't as good as maybe you think it's going to be. But he continues on. He tried entertainment. He tried more women. If we look over in 1 Kings, we can see that he had 1,000 women available for him. So, but still, he could fulfill any fantasy that he desired, but it seems he was still bored. So I wanted to read there at that number. If you have a book, page 9, there's that number 1 comment right in the middle. It says, "What will we learn? Yet we continue to fool ourselves until we play the fool. If I only had more money, if only I had that house, if only I had that woman, if only I could go to Vegas and get lucky." Solomon says, been there, don't do that, don't bother. I think that's pretty good advice, isn't it? And that you see this guy that did literally had everything and tried everything, and ultimately he was still bored and apparently not very happy. So anybody have any comments on that? So I just kind of ran through that long list before we move on to the second section of the book. Todd?
You hear a lot of men, we think about retirement, and like your entire life is about reaching retirement and those golden years. And then you hear some guys who finally retired, and then they're like missing the old days when they were at work. And it just makes me think, maybe I should appreciate what I've got right now. This is what God intends for me to be busy. And it's almost like an American culture thing that work, and then take the last 20 or 30 years off if you live that long. Mm-hmm. And I think from Solomon's wisdom here, that's not necessarily a good approach.
Yeah, there's a gentleman I remember from Jackson Heights. His name was Pete Bondra. And I remember him telling me that, he says, Jeff, and this was about just one thing, travel. He says, travel while you're young. He said, my goal was to work till I could retire and then travel. As soon as I retired, I got sick and never was able to. So to your point, and again, I think that we'll get to that in the conclusion. A balance of some of these things along the way with God involved is really where we need to be shooting for as we move forward. Anybody else on the first section? Oh, Shirley, I'm sorry. Raise high, Shirley.
No golden years.
So Shirley says there's no such thing as a golden year. Yeah, and there's not, huh? And again, when we think about that it's in seeing what he says here, it is truly that we need to live our lives day by day with God engaged in it. Is where he comes to. And, there's the golden age ain't so golden, Shirley's telling us. So, we need to enjoy what we can now and enjoy. But, you do get to have grandkids and great-grandkids. So there's a few things, right? So
everything we need. And we have a great family and all that. So we're blessed. But as far as what people look for the golden years, it's not out there.
Yeah. Good point. All right, the next section here is where he makes a comparison of wisdom and foolishness. And though he does say that, well, it's good to be wise, but in the end, what happens? Yeah, they both die, right? You know, and then it's kind of how many people are really remembered more than a couple of generations? Not many. There's a few, but not many. Most are truly forgotten. I mean, how many people that graduated from Yale and Princeton in the 1900s do you know or know of? I don't know of any, or I don't know of any now, honestly, but yeah, maybe a couple at work. But yeah, it's just kind of the things that we tend to put a lot of stock in, that he's just making the conclusion that, it's not that important, that the wise man and the fool die alike, and without God, none of this really makes sense. Now obviously, we understand that there's wisdom in wisdom, right? There's wisdom in having wisdom if we use it properly, and remember it and connect it to God and decisions we're making in our lives. But just to seek knowledge and wisdom for the sake of seeking it, it doesn't really bring you to any place beyond where the fool is. Then in verses 18 to 21, the author calls it now versus then, reading from the section B there. Work, plan, risk, sacrifice, save. And for what? Everything seems irrelevant in the face of death. You work hard, die, and then everything goes to offspring who may or may not be grateful. This too is vanity. And I think we've probably all seen this in our lives, whether it was us or friends. I had a cousin. She was an only child. Her parents saved every penny they ever made. And literally, it gave, she had millions of dollars of inheritance. Well, the first thing she did was she bought a 7 Series BMW. And then she bought a new house in Wisconsin. And you just saw that her parents had saved. And as soon as she got it, it was spend. Now, I'm sure that's not true for everybody, but sometimes you do see that happen. Or businesses that get built up and they're left to children, and what happens? They just kind of fizzle out. The passion may not be there, the skill may not be there, but with the point being, there's nothing wrong with that. Right? There's nothing obviously wrong with saving or building a business or whatever it is you might do, but you got to keep it in perspective. Again, in the perspective of including God. And then kind of there at the end of that section, it's hard work versus rest. And he kind of makes the point that is life really worth losing sleep over? In most cases, not, is it? All the things. This is something, I don't know if your work, but there's a guy at our work who always asks about new designs or what's keeping you up at night. What's keeping you up at night about that? And really, his implication is, what's going on with that you're thinking about, because it might not be right, and we need to address it. But we tend to dwell on things that we can't control. Right? There's lots of things in life that we can't control, and it doesn't do us a bit of good to lay in bed and worry about them and not sleep, does it? But that doesn't make it easy by any means. But it just trying to put our faith in God versus our faith in all these things Solomon has already tried, it will help us to strive to overcome that. And then finally, the last couple of verses, the author here calls it a brilliant moment of insight. But they're in the middle of section A and 3A. It says, remove God and you lose enjoyment, purpose, direction, meaning, hope, and everything else vital to life. And what's left? Nothing. Just 40, 50, 60, 70, 80 years of sleepless nights and nothing to show for it. Yeah, that's another good point, isn't it? We've got to removing God from our lives. And again, we see that in that whole first section. That was the I section, right? where he took God out, his conclusion was, it's all meaningless. And I did want to go back to in the previous page, number 3, where he says, close friends, a loving spouse, family relationships, a warm home, unselfish generosity, a heart for God, the hope of heaven. These are the things that make life worth living. Amen. In getting God, engaging God in our lives, and that's finally the conclusion that he makes in it there in verse 25. For without him, who can eat or find enjoyment? Now, as we flip that back a little bit, in verse 24, he does says, a person can do nothing better than eat and drink and find satisfaction in their own toil. This too I see is from the hand of God. Voila. He finally brings a connection back to God in here, doesn't he? And then, for without him, who can eat or find enjoyment? And then he goes into his the little comments about, that God is going to take care of those that seek after him. That's really what that last verse is saying, isn't it? So the point I take from this for us is that there's nothing wrong with eating, drinking, and finding satisfaction in what we do, as long as we include God. In fact, those things are good for us, isn't it? Is there anything wrong with a soccer game with a bunch of Christians out there? Or a round of disc golf? Or playing a video game? Or going shopping with your Christian friends? Is there anything wrong? Now, those things can be taken to excess. They can become too high a priority. But the inclusion of God, especially with the inclusion of brethren, what's wrong with those things? Nothing. And in fact, we need those things in our lives, don't we? To keep us balanced and to keep us, that we do deal with stresses at work and with sickness and family. We need things that can help relieve those with God, with it being centered with God, right? So anybody have any further comments on that before we get into the questions? Todd?
Yeah, it's funny how when you're just seeking after the food and drink, like maybe you just want to go have that steak dinner and have a really nice spread, that can get old if you keep seeking after that. But a sandwich that you finally get to enjoy after helping somebody, serving somebody, where you've been working hard all day, that can taste so much better than that steak when you're just indulging yourself time after time after time.
Good point.
That's part of the serving or being with God is doing God's work, and then the food is better.
Norm?
And the other part is the focus of the output. We're commanded to grow in all the ways that God gave us the talents to grow, spiritually and physically, so that the focus of that output, of that growth, is to provide back to God and to our fellow man. And you have the picture of the healthy, energetic, positive Christian out there doing more and more each year, and everybody's got somebody in mind when I said that, in their life, and they were an inspiration to you, and they were an inspiration to other people and stuff, and that's the balance. There is the focus of what's that output going towards.
And one thing that is also, there's also a community influence thing there as well. When people can see you out having fun without a beer in your hand, or doing things you ought not to do, there's nothing wrong with fun, and that can be a powerful influence on those around us to see that, well, they don't need a drink to have a good time and things like that, right? That's the influence we can have, sometimes just unknowingly at times, by just behaving like we ought to. All right, so question 1. What usually happens when one has too much money and too little accountability? Bill?
What happened to the prodigal son is what happens. You're not only not satisfied, you end up with nothing.
Yeah, that was definitely what I thought of when there with this question. Anybody else? Is this a problem for Christians? Yeah. Yeah, because, in our society, we have a lot. We may not think we do. We have a lot, and when we don't utilize it properly, you kind of get into this excess and boredom and maybe getting into stuff you ought not to. And we need to be careful about it. The Playboy philosophy does not hold the patent to the Eros lifestyle. Solomon discovered it and explored it to its depths. Sadly, his harem has been equaled via the internet and easy pornography. However, at the end of the day and at the end of the life, what does it offer? Sadness, sorrow. No, I wrote down a reference to 1 Peter, in 1 Peter 2, 11 and 12. Over there. Beloved, I beg you as sojourners and pilgrims, abstain from fleshly lusts which war against the soul, having your conduct honorable among the Gentiles, that when they speak against you as evildoers, that they may, by your good works which they observe, glorify God in the day of visitation. I mean, this kind of stuff, those words, literally wars against our soul. Right, there's a battle going on, isn't it? Satan's trying to suck us into his way of doing things and into the place we don't want to go. And we have to be wary of that and fight against it. Ken?
What was that reference?
1 Peter 2, 11 and 12.
Okay.
All right, number 3. That's the tears of a clown. The story is told of a man who goes to a doctor because he is depressed and feeling alone and anxious in a threatening world. The doctor says the treatment is simple. The great crown Terrafini is in town tonight. Go and see him. That should pick you up. The man burst into tears. But doctor, I am Terrafini. What's the lesson here? That's some name for a clown. Terrafini. Terrifying. Anybody here scared of clowns? So what's the lesson?
If being around the circus as often as Serafini doesn't make him feel better, then how would it help someone who just visits it one time? What good does it do?
Yeah, just because you're the source of laughter doesn't mean you're happy either, does it? Again, it's all back to the appropriate source. So number 4, look through the list of 9 ways Solomon sought satisfaction. Have you known anyone who's gone down similar roads? What was the result? So you don't have to name anybody. What I want to do is let's think of some Bible examples of folks that went down this route and what results they had. First one I thought of was his daddy, right? And we talked about that recently with Chris's sermon. Look at what David pursued an inappropriate pleasure, didn't he? And what did it leave him? Lots of heartache. Right? Who else could you think of? You think of anybody else in the Bible? I thought about what about the 2 kings in Daniel of Babylon? What happened to Nebuchadnezzar? He got all messed up, didn't he? Didn't he? And then Belshazzar. How did the Persians end up? What was he doing when they showed up? He was drunk, wasn't he? Having a big party. Another one I thought about was Herod with John the Baptist. Kind of those pleasure things. What was it? I forget. What was the king's name in the story with Ruth? Excuse me, not Ruth, Esther. Yeah, that guy that wanted to show his wife off and that didn't work out. Yeah, we just see that when you engage in these things, that ultimately it results in heartache, doesn't it? And we see these things in place. And I'm sure you may have thought of some people, real people in your lives that have dealt with that. Number 5, some live in the make-believe world. If only I was better looking, if only I had a bigger house, if only I had more money. What are they missing? And if their wish was granted, do you think it would make them happy? And back to we talked about this in the very beginning. The problem here is the I, isn't it? If only I. had this, that, or the other. Norm,
2 Peter 1 verse 3, God provides everything that we need to have a full life on earth. And if we're not looking toward Him for the decisions, the source, etc., we're going to miss out on it.
Okay. Number 6. According to verse 16, what do the wise man and the foolish man have in common? Death and being forgotten. Isn't it? You're going to die and you're going to be forgotten about. Number 7. Dennis Barnhart was president of a California computer company. When his company stock went public, he became a millionaire overnight. Tragically, he was killed in an auto accident the next afternoon. What is the lesson for us? Yeah. Do riches and success have any correlation to length of life? Maybe an inverse correlation there, actually, if we think about it. What does James say about the plans of men? Yeah, life is like a vapor. Yeah, whose will should we be concerned about? God's, right? You know, what's God's will for our lives, and how are we making plans in accordance with that? Number 8, what glimpse of wisdom does Solomon offer in verses 24 and 25?
Contentment is with God.
Yeah. And the things that he mentions there are what we would normally call kind of the simple things, aren't they? Just eat, drinking, your toil, just spending time with one another is kind of things that are where we can find enjoyment and fulfillment as long as we've included God in it, right? And finally, I will let you answer this one. So name some things that make life worth living. Peace of mind, okay.
Hope of heaven.
Hope of heaven.
To see your children walking in the truth.
Children walking in the truth. What about seeing your teenager walking in the door after they've been out driving? So the Forrest can relate to that, I'm sure, right now. And Melissa and Brent, it's helping your fellow man. Keeping God. Now, none of you said getting rich. Love of brethren. So I mean, obviously we're in the environment we're in. You'd expect this, but what are the things that have been mentioned? What's the theme going there? God, right? that we've included God in our lives, and with family, with friends, and to Shirley's point, where do we get the peace that passes understanding? From God. Right? That's. Don't you think it's interesting that if we really step back, that all the things that the world typically seeks after, ultimately, that God will provide it in an appropriate way for us, if we'll include Him in our lives. All right, well, time's up. Norm, you want to say one more thing? Go ahead.
Righteousness has eternal benefits as opposed to the temporal benefits of worldliness.
Good point.